Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. In this session we discuss buffer as a module in a Node.js. Also thoroughly we explain what is a buffer, why we use buffer. After that we discuss how to read and write a data using buffer, and finally we cover some functions which we use in a buffer. So let's begin. So first we talk about why we use a buffer. And after that we cover what is the mean by buffer. So as we know, in our computer system binary data is simply set ones or zeros data. So each number of a binary we called as a byte. So a buffer is a space in a memory, typically in a RAM, that store a binary data. So it's simply saying that in our computer system, the data we have to store in a form of a binary form, means a set of ones or zero data, and these data we have to store in a buffer, because buffer primarily using to store data in a binary format. Our computer convert data into binary format to store and perform an operation. So as we know, our computer primarily understand and execute instruction in the form of machine language. So what is a binary language? Consists of zeros and ones. So these zeros and ones represent electrical signals that the computer hardware interpret to perform various operations. In a JavaScript does not have a byte type of data in its core API. So in a JavaScript, we use the data in the form of a string, numbers, boolean, array, object, and a function, but does not have a byte type of a data. So in a Node.js, to handle binary data, which we have to include a binary buffer implementation with a global module called buffer. So as we sense we have to work on a binary data, for that reason we use a buffer module in a Node.js. So buffer is mainly used to store a binary data while reading from a file or receiving packet over the network. So these are the some purpose where we use the buffer module in a Node.js. So in a Node.js, we working on a file. So in that case, we are using these modules, buffer modules. So it simply says that okay, buffer class is a global class. So it can access in an application without importing buffer module. So it means buffer class is a default or a building class in a Node.js. So it is a part of a Node.js core API, and it is a globally available, means you do not need to import it explicitly to use it in our Node.js application. So this is the introduction part. In this we cover why we use a buffer in a Node.js, and also the purpose and applications of buffer modules. Now the next we will see how to create a buffer in a Node.js. Now let's see how to create a buffer in a Node.js. So as we know, in a Node.js, you can create a buffer using a buffer class, which provide a way to handle a binary data. So there are the many way to construct a Node.js buffer. So there are the some following are the most commonly used methods. Now the first type of buffer to create an empty buffer in a Node.js. So this is the following syntax of creating empty buffer with a size of 10 bytes. So look at this example. So here we create a one variable buff, and we assign a new new buffer with initialize with the 10. So this create a new buffer object with a length of 10 bytes. The argument 10 specify the size of buffer in a bytes. Now it is important to note that the previous version of a Node.js, means before version 10, you could create a buffer using a new buffer constructor. But as the Node.js version 10, the buffer constructor has been deprecated. So you should be used to create an empty buffer using a method like alloc unsafe, or the form method uh, if you are using a after version of a version 10 of a Node.js. Now the second type of to create a buffer from an array in Node.js. So this is the following syntax to create a buffer in a given array. So in this example, we observe here we use a variable buff, then we use assignment operator, then new keyword. After that, we use a buffer constructor object, and in that constructor we mention a array. So in this syntax, we observe this create a new buffer object from an array of integer. So each integer in this array, the byte value of corresponding to the index of a buffer. Now the third type of to create a buffer from a string in Node.js. Now the following is the syntax to create a buffer from a given string and optionally encoding type. So in this example, we observe again we use a variable buff, then by using assignment operator we use a new keyword, then buffer constructor, and in this buffer constructor we use two arguments. The first one is a string part and the second one is a encoding type. So the variable buff in our example is used to store the buff object created from the string with the specified encoding UTF-8. So you create a buffer from a string with a UTF and encoding. It means that the string is being to convert into its a binary representation using the UTF-8 encoding system. So these are the some methods which we use to create a buffer in a Node.js. Now the next we discuss about a kind of a operation we can perform by using a buffer object. Now in this topic we discuss kind of operations like read and write data in a buffer. So first we talk about how to writing to buffer in a Node.js. So writing to buffer, uh, so in this case we are using a write method is used to writing a data into the node buffer. Now look at this syntax. So in this syntax we have to use a buffer object. By using this buffer object we call a write method. Now in this write method we use four parameters. Now the first parameter is a string, second one is offset, third one is a length, and the last one is a encoding. So by using this method, this method to return a number of octet means byte in which string is written. If buffer does not have enough space to fit entire string, it will write a part of a string. So now in the buffer.write method accept following parameters, or you can say arguments. Now the first parameter we use in a write method is a string. So it specifies the string data which is written into the buffer. Now the second parameter offset. So it specifies the index at which buffer start writing. So its default value is 0. Now the third parameter in this write function, it specifies the number of byte to write. So its default value is buffer.length. And now the last parameter is encoding. So it specifies the encoding mechanism, and its default value is UTF-8. Now here we're talking about reading data from buffer in a Node.js. So when we read data from buffer, so in that case we are using a toString method is used to read the data from the buffer. Now the syntax, so here we are using buffer object. By using this buffer object we call toString method. Now inside of this toString method we using three parameters. The first one is encoding, Then second parameter is start, and the third parameter is end. Now we discuss about buffer.string method except the following parameters and argument. Now the first parameter is encoding. So encoding is referred to the process of converting data from one format or to represent to the another. Typically for the purpose of transmission, also storage purpose or encryption purpose. So in this case, UTF-8 is a default encoding part. Now the second parameter is a start. Now here we the beginning index to start reading. So the default value is 0. Now the last parameter is end. So the end index to end reading. So default value is a complete buffer. So these are the kinds of operation we can use in a buffer. Now here we are talking about some more operation or function which belong to the buffer by using a Node.js. So these are the list of functions which we use in a buffer like concate, slice, copy and compare. Now after that, lastly we have to practically demonstrate example on a buffer and their operation. Now the first talk about a concate function. So this function is used to join all buffer object in an array into one buffer object. Now look at this syntax. So here we use a buffer object. By using buffer object we call a concate method. Now inside of this concate method we are using a two argument. The first one is array and the second one is length. So the concate method accepts the following parameters. The first one is an array. So the array of buffer instance that we want to be a concate. Now the second parameter is the length. So it simply means the total length of concate buffer. Now the second function is a slice function. Now slice function, or we can say method, is used to retrieve sub buffers of a Node.js buffer. So in some situation we want random data except complete data from a buffer. So in that scenario we can use a slice function. Now look at the syntax. So by using a buffer object we call a slice method. Now inside of this slice method we using a two parameter. The first one is a start and the second one is a end. So start indicate the index in the buffer at which begin slicing. Now the default value is a 0. Now the second parameter is a end. So in this parameter the index in a buffer at which the end slicing. So the default value is buffer.length. It means a complete string. Now the next function is a copy function. Now in this function we are using for copy a sub buffer of a Node.js buffer. Now talking about a syntax, so here we are using two buffer 1 and buffer 2. So the buffer 1, by using buffer 1 object we called a copy method. Now inside of this copy method we use a buffer 2 object. So this copy method in a Node.js buffer class is used to copy data from one buffer to the another. So when we call a buffer1.copy function and buffer2 mentioned as a parameter, so it means you can copy a content of buffer1 into buffer2. Also one more thing talking about this function, the copy method copies the content of buffer1 into buffer2 if buffer2 is smaller than buffer1. So only the bytes that can be a fit into the buffer2 will be a copy. Or the second scenario, like if buffer2 is a larger, it will be padded with the 0. Now the next function is a compare function. So in that function which we use to comparing the two nodes each other, or we can say two buffer to comparison between a two buffers. Now look at the syntax. So here we are using a two buffer, the buffer 1 and buffer 2. So by using buffer on object we call a compare method. Now inside of this compare method we use a buffer 2 as a argument. So by using this function, so this function return me integer value in the form of 0, 1 or -1. So it's 0 if the value return me a 0 by using this compare function. It simply indicate buffer 1 and buffer 2 is the same. But if the value return in the form of is 1, so it simply indicate buffer 2 buffer should become before the buffer 1 when sorted. And the last, if the value return me a -1, so it return if the buffer 2 buffer should be a come after buffer 1 when sorted. So these are some functions and operation which belong to buffer by using a Node.js. Now the next we will see practically how to use a buffer module and their function in a practical way.